Wildman Palmer in New York City. I'm head of our emerging market practice group, and I'm lucky enough to be able to moderate this panel today. And let me just go very briefly with a couple of guidelines how we're going to try to do this panel. Hopefully you'll be able to hear as people are walking in. We're going to start by introducing everybody. And this is, for those of you who don't already know, the regulatory panel. So we're going to be talking about legal and accounting issues that impact growth in the region. We'll go through, have everybody introduce themselves. Then we're going to spend, we basically have 4 15-minute blocks of time. So my goal as moderator is to help you get to know the people on the panel. And I hope your goal being in the crowd is to get to know them as well. So we will then, after introductions, we will go into what people see as the biggest issue in the regulatory scheme here. And then we're going to go on the thing people are most concerned about. Then we'll go on to what they're most hopeful about. And then we'll end up with some conclusions. And if at any point, I know this is a little bit different than the ones we've done so far, but if at any point anybody's got a big question, please raise your hand, because we would like this to be as interactive as possible. Again, because the goal here is to help you guys get to know the people who are up here. And so, with no further ado, let's begin. We'll start with Gary, and then Fred, and then Dave, and then Tony.
My name is Gary Gibbons. I'm a visiting professor of entrepreneurial finance at Thunderbird. I do have an industry background. I was a portfolio manager for many years, but I'm pretty much retired from that business in 1990. So now I'm an academic. Do you want us to talk about what our concern is now?
Let's start with just background, and then we'll go back and go into the big.
So my background is both from industry and as an academic. I'm studying and writing in the PE area, publishing articles, and doing research at Thunderbird.
Great.
My name is Fred Burke. I'm the managing partner of the law firm Baker & McKenzie in Vietnam. Been here since the early 90s when I came down from China, where I've been working with such luminaries as Ken Atkinson here, who ran the department before that. Vietnam, since that time, has been going gangbusters, and also involved in a lot of other things like the Prime Minister's Advisory Commission for Administrative Reform, in which, in that context, I got a lot of exposure to regulatory debates and policy issues about where they should go with the regulatory system for the securities industry in particular. So that's it.
Great. Thanks, Fred.
Hi, my name is Dave Banerjee. I don't work for FINRA, but I have a practice area which is accounting and regulatory fees in the United States, and I represent pension plan managers, hedge fund managers, investment advisors, and broker-dealers. So my perspective is from foreign investments coming into the United States and the SEC's impression of those foreign investments and how they've, for lack of a better word, tried to make it more accommodating to the avenues that are available for exit strategies for funds investing in Vietnam. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Great. And Tony.
Hi, my name is Tony. I'm from PricewaterhouseCoopers, Vietnam. I started my career with VTS Vietnam, and I worked here for 6 years. After I went to VTS Singapore, where I spent the next 7 years, and I just returned here for about 2 weeks. Previously in Vietnam, we provide several services, including assurance, tax, advisory, and legal. And I'm specialized in assurance. So my career life is more to do with accounting standard, auditing standard. It's a bit boring. And I hope I come here today to share a more specific view on matters relating to accounting and auditing in Vietnam to our conference here. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And again, just so we go through the grant rules again, if you have questions, please feel free at any point to raise your hand. I'll be on the lookout. We're going to talk about biggest concern, biggest issue, whether it's positive or negative, biggest concern, biggest hope, and we'll get to conclusions. So let's start again. We'll keep going the same way. Let's start with Gary, and why don't you give us what you view the biggest issue in this area is?
In the regulatory area, I think there is an issue that is substantial and that it affects U.S. GPs. And that would be in the United States, we have a piece of legislation that will take full effect in January 1, where U.S. fund managers will have to become registered under the Investment Advisors Act. Now, that doesn't directly affect us here in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but it does affect the standards that U.S. funds have to meet as they relate to their LPs. And I'm just wondering if they haven't finally woken up to making some moves towards this area, which I hope they have, is this new requirement that they be subject to these duties and responsibilities going to impact their ability to, is it going to be another excuse not to come to the emerging markets?
That's a fascinating issue. I just have to, full disclosure, I'm a lawyer, might spend most of my time structuring around that from ever happening. Anyway, let's go ahead.
That's sort of metaphysics from my perspective, because I'm very much on the ground here in Vietnam, and helping people implement projects, set up funds, invest in projects, and make sure those projects meet their expectations. And in that context, we're dealing with the day-to-day regulations that come out of the government. And in that context, I think the biggest concern we have is regulatory coherence. Does this regulation on this side that requires you to do this match that one on that side that requires you to do that? We're in the midst of taking the first company private, delisting for the first time in Vietnam. So, maybe people don't realize we've come a long way in Vietnam in the last 15 or 20 years. Didn't have a securities market just 12 years ago. Now we've got 800 something companies listed, and we've got all kinds of things going on. A lot of things are cases of first instance that you would be familiar with in long history elsewhere and have a lot of precedent to help you solve. So here, it's constantly a matter of trying to anticipate what the government's going to do next, making sure you're in the pipeline with that, and helping them to avoid making mistakes. I mean, the good thing about the government in Vietnam is that they know that there's this coherence issue. They're learning it a lot, and they ask for help. So they distribute drafts of laws and regulations to the business community. Let us comment on those. And I got to say, we've helped them avoid a lot of train wrecks of things that would have really been impossible, just not workable. Great ideas, just like communism, but on paper it's great, but in reality it doesn't work. A lot of kind of laws would have been like that too. Going forward, I think that you've got still some big issues though. You've got the bifurcated regulatory framework for the PE industry being a whole different system for foreign invested companies versus local companies. The local funds incorporated on shores have their own rules, and if you're investing from offshore, like a Vina Capital or Indochina Capital, these guys operate according to a whole different set of rules. And in some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse. And both sides thinks the other side is greener on the other side of the fence. Then you've got the disintegrated regulatory framework on the domestic side too, so that in the securities industry, there's no such concept of universal services now in the new securities law. It's all separately divided. You have to have your management company separate from your fund. You have to have your brokerage separate from your advisory, or all these things have to be separated in theory, but in practice, it's not happening that way, at least not yet. So there's a lot of things left to change. For example, there's been a lot of talk about requiring the foreign funds to set up branches here and to be taxed as such, but they've not gotten around to doing that for various reasons. So that's a space to watch too. A lot of things like that.
I spent the last week crisscrossing the country, an extremely hectic schedule, looking at private equity transactions, and one of the items that came about was the financial reporting standards. For U.S. funds or U.S. pension endowments to be able to invest in Vietnam, one of the overriding concerns has to do with financial accounting controls and reporting standards. The U.S. is a little bit backwards. They're not going to start implementing the international financial reporting standards until next year, and even then they're going to go slow until full implementation until 2015, which means effectively the U.S. isn't going to move until 2018 into international financial reporting. But the present form of generally accepted accounting principles requires that for U.S. investors, especially LPs, to have private equity invested here to be able to convert it into U.S. reporting standards. One of the bigger issues that we are facing today in the domestic U.S. private equity market has to do with valuation of private equity. The US does not have a standard valuation methodology acceptable for generally accepted auditing standards. Europe does. And as a result of which, most of the private equity firms or funds are not getting a audit report that's acceptable. And that's leading to what he mentioned, the new rules regarding Dodd-Franks, leading to some issues regarding custody that the SEC has imposed, which is adding on to compliance responsibilities of the funds. Challenging environment. There's nothing good or bad about it. I think it makes the industry stronger because it affords a lot more protection than the laissez-faire economy. But it takes away from some of the entrepreneurship that funds are able to have to be able to invest in Vietnam. So that's from the U.S. domestic standpoint, that's going to be a challenge. So I'm going to hand it over to Tony right now, and Tony can elaborate.
Hi. With my experience of about 6 years plus in Vietnam and another 7 years in Singapore, I do see some differences between Vietnam and the region, because Singapore is known for financial hub for the region and certain things that they have developed a bit further. So there are few things in Vietnam as offshore investment fund. When you come to Vietnam and invest, you may need to be aware of. And for the timing of this conference, maybe I just limit it to 3 things. The first one, as our friend here Dave mentioned about financial reporting, and that is one of the issues for the business in Vietnam. Just a couple of days ago, I met one of the Vietnamese founder of the business, and the business is quite well known in Vietnam, set up for more than 20 years. Now he has opportunity for investment fund overseas come and want to invest in his business. The problem he has is, for more than 20 years, he don't have any financial reporting. What he has is more on a P&L for tax return purpose and some internal management reporting for management view. So now if you come in and invest in that business, how we can invest? So that is the first issue. The second issue that I see is more on the accounting standard. In Vietnam, we have our own Vietnamese accounting standard, which more or less translated from the international accounting standard. But unfortunately, that translation stopped sometime in 2004. And from 2004 until now, the international accounting standard changed dramatically. Certain things are totally new, and in Vietnam, we don't have those basic. So, just say for example, for international accounting standard, when you go and purchase a business, you may have goodwill. And under international accounting standard, the goodwill you cannot amortize. The value will be there, and every year you just need to assess whether are there any impairment to the goodwill or not. But in Vietnam, under the VTS, Vietnamese accounting standard, you have to amortize within 10 years. And that means after 10 years, the goodwill is gone. It just says the goodwill is about the brand of your business. After 10 years gone, which is not really the case. From my perspective, I think it's much increased after 10 years rather than it's gone. So there are certain things that the two get the accounting, Vietnamese accounting standard and the international accounting standard is just too different. Or another example is under Vietnamese accounting standard, you cannot fair value, you cannot revalue your fixed asset. So if you buy a business plan 10 years ago, that is the price. And even under Vietnamese accounting standard, you have to amortize it. So now you go in the price much higher. But the business, the company cannot go and revalue it and state it in their financial statement. So if you look at their financial statement, it's not true impact. The value is not there. And the third point that I want to discuss today is more on the internal controls. If you analyze about the historical business in Vietnam, you will see that the past 10 years or more, a lot of family-run business developed very fast. And during that period of time, they are very busy. So their time is more prioritized to spend to earn money, gain business, develop their business, and not much on the internal control or anything internal. So a real case example is like we experienced that company very well established. They lost the inventory for few million US dollars. and they don't know why and where it's lost. So internal control may be another issue that you may need to be aware of when you invest in Vietnam. So in summary, that are three things that I want to mention. Financial reporting, the difference between the accounting standard, and the last one is the internal controls environment.
Okay, so just for the benefit of both the panel and of the audience, we have people who deal in all different sides of this regulatory stuff. So just by show of hands, how many people here, historically, not in terms of what you're looking at, but have just dealt with Vietnamese capital? Anybody here who's just funded locally? Okay, how many are funded with U.S. money? European money?
No money?
And who's looking for money? I mean, it's interesting because all of these issues kind of tend to vary depending on where you're trying to bring the money in from. So there's different issues if you're trying to bring it in from the U.S., different issues from Europe, different issues from China and from Islamic. I mean, there's all sorts of issues. So if we look at that in terms of where the regulatory framework is going, is there any one thing that you see as your biggest concern that really needs to be? I mean, if you can have any one problem solved, Fred, let's start with you. What's the biggest problem you see out there that's causing a problem for the development?
Well, I already mentioned regulatory coherence, and I think there's an opportunity to actually start grappling with that, not just for Vietnam, but on a regional basis or broader basis. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement now that the U.S. is negotiating with several countries in the region, including Vietnam and Malaysia, that contains a whole chapter on regulatory coherence for the first time. That things should be more transparent, automatic, less subject to discretion, therefore corruption and all these other bad things. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with these free trade agreements that Obama has just put through to Congress. He's finally sent those to Congress. The attitude that we see in Congress for, say, the Korean FTA, that will be really important to signal what's going to happen with TPP and other important international trade agreements. Because these are the things, people don't realize it, but these are the things that open up markets. People, countries in the region say, okay, you haven't been able to play on this playing field, whether it's distribution services or financial services or fund management. That's been off limits to foreigners so far. But with these agreements, they open up those sectors, and so you can get a foot in the door and get a part of that market really with your own skin in the game rather than having to contract across the border. So, not in addition to the regulatory coherence chapter, what that means, the actual market access issues, a lot of them will affect people in this room. Opening the market if you can get the TPP through.
Great. And Dave, from your end, if you could solve anything.
Well, actually, a little bit of a preamble to this is, since I've been around here, most people have come to me indicating that they're interested in raising money from the United States. The U.S. is actually very friendly for investments, especially for private equity, and the SEC actually encourages. There's a significant amount of law in the U.S. that encourages private equity investments in Vietnam, or for that matter, any of the other foreign countries. One of the items that most people don't realize is that the U.S. is best as an exit strategy because it allows for private equity to get valuation. It's extremely robust. It's really the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's extremely robust. The valuations are tremendous. The investor protections are getting stronger. And liquidity is out there. So if you want high valuation, good liquidity, the U.S. is a wonderful exit strategy. In terms of private equity being raised, a lot of the avenues, for example, PIPES, Regulation S, Private Placement Regulation D, are all oriented towards the accredited investor, which is, or the qualified institutional buyer, which is really where you want to be. Endowments, pensions, hedge funds, large hedge funds, securities broker dealers, intermediaries, the over-the-counter market, bulletin board, pink sheet, NASDAQ, listings. They're all extremely friendly for foreign investments. But as we all discussed here, is that it's a wonderful exit strategy and should be developed up front, understanding the differences in legislation. So somebody can actually target this market well enough, they'd be well poised to take advantage of the U.S. market.
Great. Tony, from your perspective?
Because I'm more on professional and my focus is more on like very specific thing, but from economic point of view, I see Vietnam have a very potential because most of the business here, they have the fundamental product, which is not much impacted by the financial crisis, and so that's the evidence that we can see from the financial crisis in 2008, while other countries may slow down, but in Vietnam, it's not that much impact as compared to the other. So now it's more from the outside, if we see this opportunity and come here to invest, it's more or less on the regulation, tax, accounting standard, and so on. So it's just a matter of how we can overcome those difficulties or differences to be successful with our investment.
And just to understand that better, so when somebody's coming in, if their internal accounts don't work, it's going to be virtually impossible for anybody to put an investment in and know where it's going, right?
I think that concern is quite valid. So now it's more on the fundamental, what you are looking for. Is it the perspective of their business in the future and how you value it? And I look at it from two sides. One, if you look at it from the positive side, we see because the regulation like that mentioned over here in US, the valuation industry very developed. People know exactly where is their value. In Vietnam, maybe they are not, and because of that reason, maybe the price is much lower. And as an investor, it's the opportunity. Now, in terms of the disadvantage, maybe because it's not very clear, then you bear more risk, and that is where we hope as a professional, it's a very good opportunity for us as well to come in and provide our support.
You know, and the interesting thing about that is that they spoke about in some earlier panels, when you're trying to assess the person, it's nice to be able to think you're trying to figure out the integrity of the person you're investing in. But integrity isn't necessarily linked to disclosure if you've never had a practice of disclosing. Because, there's no background to do that, so there's going to be a lot of handholding.
I got to make a disclosure. I'm a Thunderbird graduate, and as such, I've dealt with capital raising in different countries. And when you talk about trust and element, there's a particular style that the U.S. has, which may or may not be, acceptable to some of the other cultural differences in countries. And so you have to be aware of that. And for that, if there's an investment coming in for a fund, for example, investing in any Southeast Asian countries, it would be ridiculous for them to assume that they could walk in and pick up investments. They should have a local content to that and work closely with the local partner in order to be able to assess the business risks involved in any investment, including cultural differences.
Sure. Gary, in terms of biggest problems?
Well, I actually like the whole discussion because I think it all relates together. You have the internal frictions that Fred and Tony are talking about, which are the frictions within the country that, where we struggle to get predictable, understandable, common knowledge of what the regulatory environment is. And that's so important. When we were here last year, we heard the same themes being said over and over again. And then we want to have an understanding of what the regulatory burdens are on the people that are investing, whatever country they're from. My example, metaphysical as it may be, is how are U.S. funds going to be constrained under new U.S. law? Because I'd like to see them coming here in greater amounts than they do. So if you can solve these internal issues, and it's an important thing to focus on, and then if you can have through professionals in country an understanding of what the new responsibilities to the U.S. funds are, we might be able to get more U.S. money flowing into this region. And so I think so far the panel has highlighted two really important things.
Well, and again, the fascinating thing about that is you may be disclosing one thing when the person on the other side is expecting disclosure on something else. So you don't meet at the beginning because you have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly, the burdens on the two parties may be completely different burdens. They may have different responsibilities to get different disclosure.
Now, given that, and given the growth in the region, I'm not seeing any hands. If anybody has questions, go ahead.
We haven't talked about the FCPA, and I'm a little bit concerned about the public-private partnership that we see throughout the region, and how to stay clear of that rule, because the way that's been enforced lately, it's scaring the heck out of a lot of my clients, and I wouldn't want to be investing from that standpoint.
For those of you in the back who may not have heard the questions about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. and how that impacts things here.
I mean, I was just thinking that when Gary was talking about, trying to bring the region up to those standards, some of the problems we have with the FCPA in extending those standards to a place like Vietnam, where you're asking your agent or distributor here to sign some sort of a warranty that you can come and look at my books to make sure I'm not paying any bribes to any government officials. And you've also got the problem that you're dealing with the government so often, not just in PPPs, but the whole entire healthcare sector, basically. You're always, all the pharmaceutical companies are selling to state-owned companies. Those are state decision makers. If you give them a trip to Singapore, that becomes an FCPA issue. It's really tricky throughout that's just an example. It's right throughout the economy. So it's right on the top of people's minds. And you've got huge judgments, like you say, huge penalties being issued on not just U.S. companies, companies like Siemens, $2 billion penalty, right? Very serious ramifications, and the jurisdiction is being extended very far. So definitely on the forefront of people's minds when they're doing their due diligence and trying to work with local partners to explain to them the standards that they'll be expected to meet going forward.
And even there, you end up with the issue I've already talked about with a couple of people out in the audience. Even the idea of corruption. I mean, if you're local, you may well believe corruption means one thing. If you're in the U.S., you may believe corruption means an entirely different thing. So there's no real uniformity even among that.
Yeah, the expectations of the two parties are different. So one of the things, especially for all of us here in this room, is to understand that it's not always just a matter of personality or pointing the finger or suspicion. It's a matter that one party is burdened with one duty and the other party has a totally different duty. And the two parties may not understand the context that they're dealing with each other.
One of the unique items on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States is that FINRA, which regulates the broker-dealer industry in the U.S., has made it a point in their examinations to examine for foreign corrupt practices. So we are educating our clients in terms of what procedural issues they'll have to face in terms of foreign investment. Now that's broker-dealers, that's from the execution side of the business. What is scary is even though it's a federal law, it has not exactly been imposed or included in the SEC in their examinations of advisors. However, under the new Dodd-Frank rule, they're looking at a different self-regulatory organization. And if that becomes FINRA, the fund managers, including pensions and endowments and hedge funds, are all going to be subject to the same requirements. And yes, it would have an implication. Now, I think there was a point that was made in terms of regulations pending and how it's going to impact Vietnam. There are two schools of thought. In the first process, yes, it's going to limit the amount of investments because we are seeing fund managers not being able to cope with the procedural issues. But number two is once they get over it, and they will get over it because the opportunities are so enormous, then they will adhere to those standards and come on in. And let me explain why. The last couple of months I've been speaking a lot to pensions and endowments, and they've got a very common problem. Their pension obligations are going through the roof, and their alpha has not kept pace with their pension obligations. So they're looking for uncorrelated alpha or beta, and emerging markets offer that. So, we talked this morning at breakfast regarding policies being set up by pension plans regarding alternative investments and emerging market investments. So they're already crafting from the board. They're looking at education in terms of emerging markets and the issues. In their due diligence in terms of advisors, they're putting that component in terms of the experience that they have in emerging markets. So yes, there'll be a lull for a certain period, but trust me, they'll get over it.
But of course, this goes back to Tony's point earlier, that if you're a local business and you've been delivering the profit and loss statement you want to deliver, it's a whole different world when you try to bring somebody from the outside in. Because although you think what you have are complete books, they're not complete for the person on the other side. And even if you want to do the investment, the big challenge for anybody in the middle is making sure that both sides understand whatever the issues are. Because there's usually a way around them. if you get to the point that people are actually talking about the same thing. Then moving on to the next thing, in terms of things that make you hopeful about the region, both in terms of bringing in investments, about, whatever. Dave, why don't we start with you? Are there things that I mean, you're here because you're hopeful, right?
Absolutely. I think I'm very positive about Vietnam. It's got a tremendous young population, which are educated, although there's some question about the relevancy of education, but you have a literate young population. You have strengths in earth sciences, minerals, agriculture, which are very basic, and they keep up with inflation. You have, so yes, I am very positive, provided there's a tremendous amount of opportunities here, and it's for the picking. So fund managers would be stupid enough not to consider this region, but they have to educate themselves on this region first in order to know the differences. And by the same token as what we are talking about, is issuers in this market will also have to educate themselves about meeting the standards of investors in the United States. And they'd have to go through that education process. So somebody has to bridge that gap. And I'm hoping that some of the larger accounting and auditing firms and law firms can help them do that. No, I'm very hopeful. I think there's a wonderful opportunity. We talked a little bit about Laos being landlocked and the opportunities there are for ports. One of the things I did meet up with was a port up in central Vietnam, and it was enormous. Also food and agricultural distribution. You've got the largest lychee growing population here. China is a huge market. I mean, generally Southeast Asia is a wonderful market. You've got resort developments. You tend to forget that the domestic market itself is extremely large. So, this focus on going into the United States has to be tempered by looking at the domestic market. One other point, and then I'm going to shut up, has to do with foreign exchange policy. U.S. investors would only be interested if there's the ability to remit funds back to the United States. So foreign exchange policy, inflation policy are all critical. One of the advantages of Vietnam is because the internal bank interest rate, which has been the traditional form of growth capital, is so extremely high that in order to meet that requirement, the IRR is significantly higher. The problem is for U.S. investors to come in is that IRR is going to be tempered by a decline in foreign exchange rates. And so that's one of the questions that a foreign fund investor would have to ask when investing in Vietnam.
Question back here? No problem. As we do that, in terms of conclusions that you draw from kind of the